Welcome to the program. I'm Young Kim at Real Talk. Last September, the Database Center for North Korea Human Rights published the 2011 White Paper on Human Rights in North Korea. It was documenting 35,000 known cases of human rights violations. Shockingly, this is an increase of 13,000 cases from the previous year. As awareness of this issue has been increasing around the globe, we now must ask ourselves, what do we do about it? So join us as we explore the ongoing crisis that's taking place in one of the most militarized, isolated, and impenetrable nations around the world today. Welcome to the program. First of all, let me thank you for making the time to be on the program today. And I would like to start by saying that you all participated in the 8th International Parliamentarians Coalition on North Korea Human Rights and Refugees. I know it's a mouthful, so for the rest of the program, let's call it the IPCNKR. And I'd like to ask you to start the program by introducing yourself. So let's start with Mr. Devlin.
Yes, my name is Barry Devolin, and I'm a Member of Parliament from Canada. And this is the third IPCNKR annual meeting I've attended in Washington this year, in Ottawa, Canada last year, where I was host, and 4 years ago in Seoul, Korea. So it's an important group, and I'm glad to be a member.
I'm the Eunjae Lee. Also, I'm the Korean National Assembly member, and then also I'm the chair of the committee of National Korean Party of the Northern Human Rights and Refugees.
And I'm Ed Royce. I've been involved since the beginning with this initiative and with this attempt to bring together parliamentarians from around the country in order to focus attention on this problem and help bring some pressure on the government of China to get them to be part of the solution and not part of the problem.
I want to go back and talk about the 8th IPCNKR General Meeting that you all participated this year. So can you tell me, first of all, how many countries were represented?
Well, I think there were about 8 or 9 different countries represented. It's interesting. Members of the coalition are individual legislators. So this is not necessarily government representatives, but they're individuals that come from different countries that have a particular interest in this file. And for example, we had one delegate this year from Poland who gave us a very interesting perspective on a communist state and what goes on inside that country. And so it's an interesting mix of people, and people have their own points of view, and that kind of adds to the quality of the discussion.
So as legislators, this meeting is important in my perspective because when you go back to your respective countries and your legislature, you're able to offer legislation or resolutions pertaining to this issue. So on that note, let me ask you, what are some of the things or action items that you were able to implement?
We have here a sort of an ad hoc human rights caucus. And Barry, I think in one sense, what we're doing on an international level is the same thing. Right. But because of the Human Rights Caucus that we have here, we were able to garner support for several pieces of legislation. One in particular directed our government to intercede with the government in China in order to try to get them to support the 1951 UN Convention
on
and the 67 Protocol in terms of the way in which refugees are treated. And another initiative is my legislation which would assist in the adoption of these stateless children. One of the things you find in a situation like this on the North Korea-Chinese border, you have women who come into China with their small children. They're either kidnapped and sold then, trafficked. All of a sudden you have these orphan children, or they might be preyed upon and sold to a Chinese father, and then the child is born, and it's basically an orphaned, stateless little child. But it's amazing up there in that part of China on the North Korean border how great a humanitarian crisis these types of situations are. These are literally children without a country and without a parent.
Parliamentary systems work a little different than Republican systems do, so just the number of bills actually passed through the Canadian Parliament in a year is much less than the number of bills that would go through the U.S. Congress. But there are other ways for us to raise our voice. I mean, we have motions. We had hearings at a subcommittee on human rights this year. There was a motion that came from that was unanimously supported by all four parties. We have four different parties in our Canadian Parliament. So I think the exact tool that's used varies from country to country, but I think the shared objective of all members of the IPC is to go back to their home country and to raise the profile of the issue and to get their respective legislatures and governments to do something that raises the profile of this issue, that lets North Korea know that we don't agree with their behavior. But in addition to that, it's not just North Korea, but as Ed said a couple of minutes ago, when North Korean citizens get into China, at that point, it's up to China whether they're going to respect multinational agreements that they have signed. And so some of our efforts are directed at North Korea, but others are directed at China and other countries. So that's the road that we're all moving down. We just kind of take some different steps in different countries.
Mr. Royce, I know you chaired the session. I believe it was to discuss what are some of the alternative ways to help reduce the human rights violations that's occurring, and what are some of the better ways to help the refugees that are defecting.
Well, I think there's some long-term solutions that I'm sure will help change behavior in North Korea. One of them is the broadcasting that's being done by the international community. So South Korea now, and the United States with Radio Free Asia, which was legislation I supported or carried, the BBC, so many different networks are now broadcasting in to North Korea on a regular basis. And we find that among those who are defecting, over half of the people are now listening to these radio broadcasts. Now, this is very different than the situation in the past, which means that now we're talking to people who serve as officers in the military, those who serve as governmental leaders, mid-level. They are following this as well. And they're becoming aware of the fact that the methods of strong-arming people and not allowing them rights in North Korea is very different than the rest of the world. That people have opportunity in the rest of the world. It's information getting in that's changing that. Right. So as information is coming in, this is a way that the norms or of behavior are going to be changed. This is the way that people are going to understand that, you know, they're under a state where torture is the rule, and that the rest of the world does not live this way. And that's what people need to understand in North Korea, because that's how we'll get change for human rights in North Korea.
Well, I was going to say, it was interesting today also to hear from Mr. Shin Dong-hyuk, who a young man who was actually born in one of the camps and lived there most of his life, and which is really hard to even imagine when you just think about it, that a person is born in one of these gulags, that is their reality. And when we asked him some questions, what was it like, and what do you recall, how did you think? And he said, well, when that's where you're born, and the fact that you don't live with your parents, and the fact that you struggle every day, and the fact that 6-year-old children work, if you're a 6-year-old kid and that's all you've ever seen, that's all you know. And it was fascinating to listen to him, because in the camps they are so isolated in terms of information. But he said someone else was sent into the camp who had been in the outside, and when he first started hearing the stories, he said at first he just didn't believe it. And but after a while he heard more of these stories, and so it was interesting to listen to him explain his own experience. And when he got out of the gulag just into North Korea. How free and wonderful it seemed to him compared to what he had known. So it's if North Korea is, in some senses, is a large prison camp, then within that larger prison camp there are these gulags that are kind of further isolated. And so I think information is key.
Yes.
And once information penetrates general North Korean society, it will eventually then make its way into the camps as well.
Sure.
And that's what will cause people to demand change.
So at the end of the day, after each general meeting of IPCNKR, as legislators, you are determined more than ever to go back to your respective legislature and to do something about it. At a minimum, what can you do?
First of all, that Hae-soo Kim, but she lived also that prison camp about 28 years, and then she drew the picture, and then many places she showed the picture.
Yeah.
First time I invite her to my party, and then she explained about that picture, how did she live, and then everybody really surprised to my party members. So that is very, very, very important. But problem is that refugee came very recently, and then also they gave us the information very recently. So the first very important thing is we're gonna invite them, and then they explain about how they lived in the prison camp. That is very important.
So you're talking about inviting the witnesses, the defectors, to share their story, and you're providing the forum for them to tell their story.
Well, one thing that our colleague from Poland said was that when he looks back to immediately before the Iron Curtain fell, people didn't expect it to happen. So in a sense, it gives me cause for optimism, that because if you look right now, it doesn't look like the North Korean regime is weakening or that anything is going to change soon. But when you talk to people who've lived through the experience, they say, well, right up till the last moment, sometimes it's not evident. And I think that what we're doing by focusing attention on the issue is if we keep reinforcing something. If I can use an analogy, my father-in-law is a stonemason. When he takes a large piece of granite that he wants to break in two pieces, he looks for the grain and he starts hitting it with the hammer. And for 45 times in a row, he hits it in the same spot and nothing happens. And on the 46th time, it splits open. And the 46th hit is no harder than the 33rd or the 25th. But sometimes just keeping sustained pressure on something, somehow out there's a tipping point or a critical mass, however you want to say it. And that's why I'm not discouraged in the sense that what we're doing has value. I know it has value, and I want to be there the day that rocket splits in two, or that all of a sudden it's headline news that some major thing has happened in North Korea. So that's what we're working on. And just because we can't measure progress from month to month, I don't think that means that it doesn't matter what we're doing.
I wanted to ask you that your thoughts on the United Nations recent resolution. The recent resolution included a new provision, something about food aid to North Korea. And countries voted for that. So I wanted to ask you, different legislators from various countries, what is your respective legislature or the government's view on providing food aid to North Korea?
Our government regarding the food program is very positively. Even that food doesn't go to directly to the North Korean people. That food is using always for the Kim Jong-il system. That is a real problem. But our government will considering very positively about food aid. And then also that North Korean is really changing now. We have some statistics, like two things I can tell you. First of all, some people are using the internet, so they are, they got some information what's going on in the world. And the second one, they are using cell phone at least 500,000 people with the Chinese people. So maybe that is a little bit change to the people's mind. So that is a very good signal for us.
Well,
Canada?
We don't directly provide aid to North Korea. We do it through the the food program, and the question that you're asking actually leads to a bigger question around how do we move North Korea in the way that we want them to go? Do you punish them, or do you try to engage with them? And I think that if there's a humanitarian issue and the concerns that we're going into another harsh winter in North Korea, and that there's going to be more of food shortages and more starvation, I think on a certain level we have to respond kind of human to human in terms of helping them, but at the same time not doing it in such a way that it allows the regime to survive longer. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that one, and I think that that's something that we all struggle with. And as I say, from Canada's perspective, we participate through the food program rather than dealing with them directly.
I'm reminded of a conversation some years ago with Wang Zhang-Yap, that I had in Seoul. And he explained to me the way in which the regime used food as a weapon. And in the areas in North Korea, where they don't perceive the populace as being particularly supportive, the populace is starved. It's a lot like what the Spartans did. What was it, the Helots? There get to be too many, and they once a year, they'd wipe out a lot of them. And he said that what they were doing was basically bolstering their political party and their military operation with the intention of developing nuclear weapons. And at the same time, they would throw all of the resources into that. The part that becomes the difficult question is that in order to do that, they are willing to take food aid and use it to both feed the army, or if there's excess food, to sell it on the food exchange in the capital, and then use the hard currency. So this is the difficult situation, because we do have audits where NGO groups followed the trucks. And in one case where they thought there'd actually been deliveries, they went back and they were told the government came in that night, took the grain, put it back on the truck, trucked it back out. French NGOs tell us this, our NGOs tell us this. It's a very sad situation, but it's a very ruthless policy by North Korea.
Last year when Kim Hae-suk was in Canada speaking about her experience, somebody asked her the question, should we send food aid and does it get to the people? And I still remember her response because it was very startling. And what she said very matter-of-factly was, if you send food, it does not get to the people. She said, if you want to help the people, send animal feed, because animal feed will be passed along to the areas where the animals are, and people will, ordinary people will actually have a better access to animal feed than food. And as I say, what she said was shocking, and as equally as shocking was how matter-of-fact and practical she was when she said that. And she said because that obviously won't be diverted to the army or to the elite, and so it gets it out into the countryside. And
thanks for that heads up.
The bottom line is that that's a lower grade of food, but it's better than nothing.
Right. I mean, obviously, animal feed will not be favored by the elites or the military, so that makes perfect sense, and that's a very valuable information you shared. Yeah. In respective countries and the areas that you represent, as concerned legislators, I know you work with a lot of NGOs and human rights activists. So can you tell us some of the groups that you work with, respectively?
Well, LINK comes to mind for many of us, their work on the campuses. Because
LINK, you're talking about Liberty in North Korea.
Liberty in North Korea. I mean, they're very, very active as young people in high school and college, educating students that otherwise would be completely unawares as to what was going on. And also they do a lot of relief work to try to assist people, especially defectors.
So Representative Lee, in South Korea, who do you work with?
One of NGO group is sending the balloon yeah, to the North Korea, and then they put some message, like that Kim Jong-il is a real bad person, something like that, and then we put some $1 paper money, American $1 paper money, and then the North people, if they pick up the money, then they can use some, they can buy some food or some other things. So some NGO group is working to send the balloon, and then we push to another NGO group to also like that, and then they could change their mind like that way. Yeah.
And you have some organizations, I know.
Yeah, there are a lot of groups in Canada and kind of involved on different levels. And I guess the most obvious level is trying to directly assist people who are currently living in North Korea. And like the United States and Canada, many of these are church groups that try to send aid, that try to funnel resources. There's a Canadian project to provide machines that would create soy milk that for children, that they would get these machines into North Korea so that they could convert soya into milk for children. Another layer of activity is trying to help the North Korean citizens who escape into China. It's a smaller number of people, but I think there's the sense that while we probably have very little influence directly on the North Korean government, we have a better chance of trying to persuade China to live up to some of their obligations. And so there are certainly groups that deal with defectors and try to get them through China out to other places and help them get settled somewhere. Including in Canada, we have organizations in large cities, Toronto and Vancouver, where many immigrants and North Korean refugees arrive to help them settle.
Well, as we close the program, I want to ask if any of you have parting thoughts to our viewers and any advice or plea to the international community to do something about this human rights situation.
It's incumbent upon all of us to think about what each of us can do to educate other people, to communicate with the media about it, and to try to get personally involved if you can in this situation, because there isn't any place on the planet today with as egregious the amount of human rights violations as people live under on a daily basis in North Korea. It's a major humanitarian interest. It's a major security concern. And of course, as long as this stays unresolved, it's going to continue to have the ability to roil markets in South Korea and Asia. Every time a North Korean leader acts up, you see the result.
Yeah.
So I do think if we think long range on this, let's have the international community work together in order to get information into people's hands so that they can change. Eventually, they'll push for the kinds of changes we see in North Africa or Eastern Europe.
Sure.
I think that mass communication is very important role for that. And then they have to show, and then they have to inform to the all the people. And then also there's some refugees go to Laos or Vietnam, like East Asian country. So also maybe our government will talk to some Asian government, and then they accept the refugee, and then they inform to our government that we're gonna deal with them. That is important. Sure. Yeah. Okay.
Well, I guess what I would like to say to people is, in my view, this is not a Korean issue. This is a human issue.
Right.
And I think that all of us, whether we have any direct connection with Korea or not, should be concerned and alarmed with what's going on. In the same way that, the world condemned, what went on in Nazi Germany 60 years ago. We condemned what happened in Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge. We've condemned what happened in Rwanda with the mass murders that took place there. So I think that's my first comment to people, is that this is not a Korean issue. This affects all of us.
Right.
And I think that if I agree with my colleagues that we need to get the word out, because if the average person hears the testimony of one of these South Korean refugees, you're only left with one of two conclusions. Either it's a complete lie, and you say that just simply can't be true, and I don't believe it. Or if you believe it, you feel compelled. You have to feel compelled to want to do something about it. Right. There's no interpretation or gray area here. So I think that's part of what we're doing, is getting the word out, and I think many people will reach the same conclusion that we did, which is that we all need to do something. We need to work together to do something about this.
Well, on that note, let me thank all of you for joining us on the program. So thank you very much. Thank you. Human rights isn't something that is given to us by someone else. We're all born with it. In other words, these are our fundamental rights that is given to us from the time of birth, and it should never be ignored or violated. So as citizens of a free world, we must stand firm against these violations that is happening to people like every single day, everybody like us. And we need to say to ourselves, now we know what's happening, what are we going to do about it? So let's stand firm and help those whose rights have been taken from them. We need to help them preserve their freedom and dignity. That's all in today's Real Talk. I'll see you next week.